Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar, Cloud Security Primer. It's brought to you by Sensato. I'm Lori from HIS Talk and I'll be moderating. I have a few housekeeping items to make you aware of before we get started. Attendee phone lines have been muted to prevent background noise. You can use GoToWebinar's questions box in the console to submit your questions to our presenter at any time. The presenter will answer your questions during Q&A, which will follow the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive links to the recording as well as a link to a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. Our presenter today is John Gomez. John is currently the CEO of Sensato, a cybersecurity and privacy healthcare company, JGo Labs, a product design and management consulting firm, and Group Espada, which provides counter-terrorism services. Previously, Mr. Gomez was the Chief Technology Officer and Co-President of Allscripts. Mr. Gomez was also the CTO of Eclipsys and WebMD and worked at Microsoft in various capacities. With that, I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thank you, Laura. So I want to welcome everybody to this afternoon's presentation, or this morning, depending on where you are. Do want to thank you and appreciate your time for spending some time with us. My hope is that this is going to be highly informative and valuable to you and your organization. Laura gave you a brief background on who I am and what I've done both in and outside the industry. Just a quick word on the two organizations that are most relevant to our talk this afternoon. Sensato is specifically focused on cybersecurity and privacy in healthcare and only healthcare. We're one of the only firms that specifically just works within the healthcare space regarding cybersecurity. JGo Labs is more of a product design, development, and management consultancy firm, but more and more we get involved in cybersecurity research, specifically in the area of cyber munitions. So there's some relevance on the work that we do there to our discussion and work that we do in the healthcare cybersecurity space. So with that, let's just jump into it. Key objectives for this presentation is to help you provide you an understanding of some of the cloud-based approaches and challenges. Secondly is talk to you about some of the options for attempting to secure cloud-based solutions. And hopefully dispel a few myths or give you some insights that you can put in place for your RFPs if you're moving to the cloud or if you're in the cloud, things that you may want to go back and discuss and renegotiate with your vendors and providers. So we'll go through each one of those things and hopefully you'll have some aha moments as we go. As always, if I don't cover something or I don't go deep enough or I did go a little too deep, please feel free to send in a question or contact me directly, and I'll provide you with contact information at the end of the presentation. Quick disclaimer, the information I provide here is simply a snapshot in time. Your particular situation may be slightly different or totally different, but the information here is provided for your own education and not as a definitive consulting or guidance. And again, please do everything to adhere to your local laws and regulations. Given that we're talking about cybersecurity, I always like to make sure that people are aware of the fact that put these things in context. So that aside, just some terms that you may or may not know, and I probably will use throughout the presentation. Attack surface is basically the entire landscape of anything that can be attacked. In the context of the cloud, that's a very large context, a very large landscape. And I will say that, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, the attack surface typically, when we work for a healthcare organization or part of an IT organization, we're believing that the attack surface is those systems within our immediate control, those things within our data center, data rooms, or networks. When we're talking about the cloud, it's basically every computing resource under control by your cloud provider. And so you need to really think about that. If you're hosting, for instance, ABC cloud services, everybody that they manage, every piece of computing environment is part of that attack surface. It's an extremely large attack surface. If we're talking about Azure or Amazon Web Services, it's all of Azure, all of Amazon Web Services. Second thing is an attack pivot. This comes into play within the surface. So if I were to breach, say, point A in the cloud, and I can use that then to kind of launch another attack against a second computing resource The point where I launch the second attack is considered the pivot. And the last thing is attack escalation. I start small, gain a little bit of entry in some way, shape, or form, and then I escalate my attacks from low to high value. And all of these things are applicable to the cloud. And as we see, they'll become much more of a concern for us in the cloud to manage and deal with. There are a couple of cloud deployment models and service models that we're going to talk about very quickly just so that we understand them. We'll briefly get into each one of these a little bit more as we present. But the deployment models are, government, which means that the government is operating that cloud entity. And that could be anything from a government-sponsored information exchange for us in healthcare all the way through a registry that's funded through a third party such as the academic institution, things for the NIH, data collection, data reporting, surveillance systems from CDC. Those will all be considered cloud-based environments that are owned and operated by the government. Private is simply that you've got pretty much a focused provision of services for a single entity. So your organization may have contracted in such a way that you have your own set of resources. And we'll see that there's some misnomers with that it's not totally private. And there's some things that even when you call it a private cloud, except in some very rare instances, are really, truly private. And it's because of cost and the benefit of the cloud. When you get to such a point where it's really all for you, then really what you have is a remote data center. The public cloud, as most of us, is what we mostly consider or think about when we're thinking about the cloud. This is, Azure, Amazon Web Services, Rackspace. You're most likely going to deal with this either in the shadow cloud, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or if you're using services from a vendor, or if you're a vendor providing services, you're more than likely providing a public cloud offering. And then the community cloud, the biggest example we have of this in healthcare would be an HIE, where we have several healthcare organizations that are all kind of focused on exchanging data in the cloud, and so have a very common mission. A hybrid of this is not as atypical as we would think. We often see these kind of things in payer models, where payers are creating kind of a hybrid of the private-public community model. So we'll talk each one of these a little bit more. And then within each of these deployment models, we have service models. You may be contracting for infrastructure as a service, simply using things like storage, and you're completely managing that storage. You may be contracting for virtual machines or computing time. We see a lot of this in academic and research institutions within healthcare, clinical trials, specific research around cancer, genomics, biomedical research, and things like that. So infrastructure as a service is just basically contracting for the hardware. Platform as a service is where you may have the hardware, and you also may be contracting for the operating system, possibly people, management, and other things. And then lastly, software as a service, where you typically are getting everything, the infrastructure, the platform, and the software itself, all combined into a final offering that adds value to your organization. We're seeing more and more of this occur in the population health and analytics space within healthcare. So, cloud computing at the end of the day is really a return to our roots in the world of computing. Basically, we share everything from the hardware to the software to the people to the policies to the risk. If you're old like me, you'll think back and realize that these architectures are very similar to what we saw in the IBM 360s or the AS400s or the DEC computing environments. They're simply mainframes, or mini mainframes, which are based on time-sharing models. And so we kind of go back to our roots when we talk about cloud computing. And it makes a tremendous amount of sense from a cost perspective. It's rather interesting that we went from the original model to a very personal desktop model to now back to a shared model. And the shared model seems to be taking a massive foothold in terms of its evolution and future. I have no doubt that as life evolves, we'll see more and more of the cloud evolve, and it will become the standard computing model going forward. And because of that, we need to really be aware of the implications on cybersecurity and privacy. Please understand that anything I talk about the rest of this presentation is not meant to get you to shy away from the cloud. It's simply to help arm you with information that you can use to make educated decisions, evaluate people on a very well-informed manner, and think through the risks very clearly and cleanly in terms of what you're facing so that you can put policies and governance in place to manage those things. So here's some interesting marketing. I took this off of one cloud organization's materials. I removed their name. At least I hope I did, but I did. Yes, I did. And but it's very similar to the pitch you're going to hear from most cloud companies or cloud-based vendors, whether they're providing you with software or they're providing you with infrastructure, whether they're a hosting organization or a big data population health company. At the end of the day, they're going to tell you that, look, things are much better if we can manage it. It's going to be secure and private, very similar to this tagline. And the reality is that this is a huge myth. At this point in time, I would argue and debate that putting things in the cloud is no more secure than you running them in your own data center. If you're going to go to the cloud, then really focus on economies and what you're going to get in terms of an economic value versus, the idea that you're suddenly going to be more secure and things are going to be more private, more highly available, or perform better, or any of that, especially in terms of security and privacy. Now, I'm not saying that to dissuade you from going to the cloud or using the cloud, but simply to kind of just call a spade and let you know that, don't fall for this tagline. It's not true, and you need to take some steps in order to deal with this. So to kind of talk about that a little more in depth, let's talk about the key threats that you face in the cloud. Now, you can say that many of these are the same threats that you would have in your own organization if you were managing your own data center, so you're more secure in the cloud or less secure than you are with you managing your own organization and your own systems. And I would probably debate that as well from the perspective that when you put things in the cloud, you create a layer of exponentialism. So if you have something occur to you in your own organization, the risk is much higher of it occurring in a cloud environment. Therefore, you must have better policies, better testing, better assessments, and understanding of what you're dealing with in a cloud environment. So first and foremost is obviously data breach. Right? This is a situation where somebody breaches the cloud environment that you're using and takes your data or gets access to your data. And it's a little bit different than data loss. Data loss is when actually physically someone is taking your data. And what I mean by that is either taking ownership of it or somehow changed the data or done something to it that you no longer have access to it. Typically in a breach, they'll copy the data. But in a loss, you've literally lost access to your data. Now, the reason that these things become exponential is simply because of what I said earlier, that in a cloud environment, you're not just managing your own environment. You don't have walls around your own environment. Even if you're told you have walls around your own environment, you still have everybody else on that cloud backbone that you're sharing with. So there's chances always that they become breached. That becomes an attack pivot that causes you to be breached. Account and service hijacking is simply the idea that a breach or that an attack occurs and they take over your service or your attack. Insecure APIs are probably one of the biggest, if you ask me to stack rank these things, insecure APIs would be in the top 3 of security challenges. The reality of life is that the way that the APIs are designed for cloud computing need to be designed in such a way that security is first and foremost. In order for that to occur, these APIs need to be very, very tightly audited. There needs to be resiliency in terms of repudiation and other things. But my biggest concern for anybody would be how you're designing your APIs or what APIs you're consuming from a cloud service. So if you're using, let's say, population health in the cloud and they have an offering, I would really want to understand their security architecture. And even if you're not writing code to their APIs, you really need to be aware of their APIs and how they're really, really managing that and translating data back and forth and what that entire ecosystem looks like. If you're a vendor, you really need to spend time figuring out how to design your APIs. Denial of service is obviously a big one. If somebody goes after an environment and brings down the cloud infrastructure, then you're down. So that resiliency and that ability to recover from cloud-based services you need to really understand. This is one where marketing has done a great job of telling you that things are redundant and we manage it and we have this and we have that. And we're going to come back a little bit later to something that denial of service, as it stands today, could be exposing you to legal challenges because of a way that some agencies or some marketers, some providers of cloud services have engineered their resiliency and redundancy. It has to do with economics, so we'll come back to that. By chance I don't come back to it for whatever reason, please remind me in the questions. The malicious insider is probably one of the bigger threats. You have no control typically over who's hired, their backgrounds, or who's working on your systems. In fact, it's very faceless to you, and often this is promoted as a great thing, that you don't have to worry about hiring the system administrator, the backup administrator, your security people. The reality is you do need to worry. And if you're putting together an RFP, you should be asking how people are hired and who is actually touching your systems. So that's a big deal. That's probably, again, one of the top 3 threats I would tell you about is insecure APIs and a malicious insider. Abuse of cloud services is another one. One thing on the cyber research side of what I do around cyber munitions, we use the cloud extensively to test algorithms. And so, as much as clouds exist, using those resources for nefarious activities is actually becoming much, much more powerful. Botnets now are starting to be masked within cloud services. So it's something to keep in mind, especially if somebody's using a cloud provider for quote-unquote nefarious services that you're also hosting your systems on. So you may want to ask your cloud provider, what are they doing to assure that their systems are not being used for nefarious services or nefarious research of sorts. Insufficient due diligences, this isn't really related to an attack, but it is the fact that a lot of people jump into the cloud and just really trust the marketing. There's obviously things you put in your RFP, which I'm sure I've responded to many of them, and they're quite thorough. But if we jump ahead to the last point here, the insufficient expertise of what to ask and what to really think about when you're crafting those RFPs can become a challenge. And so my suggestion to you is really make sure you understand any cloud-based service that you're going to sign up for before you get involved with it. And the shared technology we talked about, the attack landscape is everything and anything that cloud provider has that they're offering as a service to others, and as well as their internal systems. And we don't have enough time to get into it today, but just keep in mind, any cloud provider, it's just everybody you're sharing, everybody who's also buying from that cloud provider is a potential challenge to you, as well as all of the internal systems that that cloud provider is using. So these are the things that keep us up at night. It's the top list. And so let's talk a little bit about transitioning from the kind of threats we have to the areas of concern. So if you think about this, it's kind of like a funnel. What we're saying is, hey, we have, here's the cloud, here's the types of clouds. Let's now start talking about, we just talked about the key attacks that we could see on the cloud. So now let's start talking about concerns. So privileged access, we talked about this, is kind of the insider attack employee that works for the cloud company, as well as one of your own employees. But the challenge here is you can hopefully screen and hire your employees. You're interviewing them. You have processes for that. You don't really have those processes. These on the cloud vendor side. Regulatory compliance is a big one. You're ultimately responsible for your data, regardless of who you've contracted with. And I can tell you that there's a lot of companies, especially on the vendor side, who have a lot of plans for your data. And you need to be really, really, really aware of what's happening with your data, because it is a concern. And if you've talked to some of the companies that are out there and developing their strategies, and in goodwill, and there's nothing nefarious about it, they're just saying, hey, if we can do this, 5 years from now, we'll have access to millions of records, and we can do this with the data. The result and the reality is it's your data regardless of where it may live. You cannot contractually sign away your rights or a patient's rights to data. So keep that in mind, that there's a lot of regulatory compliance that you're ultimately responsible for. Your RFPs and your contracts need to reflect that, and you need to have that really buttoned down. And that brings us to data location and what I mentioned earlier around recovery and resiliency. So one thing that most people don't think about is really asking, where is my data stored physically? I want the name of the I want the address of the location. I want the city and state. And you'll hear a lot of the marketing, well, our security procedures, we don't disclose that because it's part of our security, and you don't have to worry about it. I would tell you to call poo-poo on that. There's a lot of cloud organizations, and vendors may not even know this. You may have signed out with a vendor who's hosting at a cloud organization. Will gain their economies of scale by moving the data offshore. And so if you're in a recovery situation, they may tell you, hey, we can support 5 nines or 4 nines or whatever you need, and if there's an interruption or we do a backup, you actually don't realize the fact that you've been switched to a data center outside the United States. If we go back to regulatory compliance, that may be an issue for you, because depending on what data is being put where, you may have a problem with the Patriot Act. So my suggestion, I'm not a lawyer, is make sure you understand where your data really is, where it's going to be coming from if there's a backup situation or a disaster recovery situation, where the data is stored off-site. So again, it just goes back to you're the custodian of the data. So you never want to hear that, well, we stored the data in some third world country and you're now not in compliance with regulatory issues. Data segregation is another one, and goes hand in hand with services segregation. You really want to understand how your data is being segregated and what's in place to protect it from others. And this is a very complicated issue. There's discussions on, in a community around HIPAA that can you share data in memory, not just on the hard drive, but what happens when data is being moved around the network. So you need to really think about the implications of data segregation. And we just talked about recovery a little bit, that yes, this may not be one of the top things you have to be concerned about when it comes to security, but when you're in a recovery situation, again, where's that data live? Investigative support is a big one. I've seen RFP go out where, and this typically happens when the organization A, let's say Acme Hospital or Acme Health Systems, contracts with Bravo software vendor and signs an agreement for cloud-based security, or cloud-based systems rather, let's say Pop Health. And what they don't realize is that, Bravo healthcare software company is actually hosting their stuff at Y cloud organization. And now a breach occurs. And you go to your software vendor and go, well, what happened? Tell me what's going on. We need to really take a look at this, because you're ultimately responsible, right? If a breach occurs with somebody else, and you contracted them, it's still your data. The challenge now is you start digging into the details once the breach has occurred, and you find out that this cloud organization with the software company you contracted with doesn't have to be all that friendly or helpful during an investigation, right? They don't have to tell you the details of what occurred. The contract states that they don't have to disclose certain things, and now you're up against the wall. Or you're in a situation where you got to bring in, lawyers and try and get an injunction or whatever it may be. Sorry, get a subpoena for the information and whatever. Point is, from the get-go, you need to really understand what investigative support or limitations you'll have when you're dealing with either your software vendor or the cloud organization that they're contracting to support their products. It's really important. And in fact, I would tell you that if you're going to contract with somebody, say in big data or population health, because that's where we're seeing a lot of the cloud computing contracts occurring right now, you need to let that vendor know that in the event of a breach or an incident, you're in charge, and that you're not going to ask them to work as an intermediary between you and the cloud. Now, this is going to get really interesting, because if they got breached and 50 or 60 of their clients have been breached, it's going to be real interesting to figure out who's going to be in charge and how. So keep that in mind. You may have very limited rights if you get breached as to what you can do and not do. And probably your board of directors won't be very happy to find that out if there's ever a breach, which hopefully you won't face. Long-term viability, really understand what happens if your contract expires or the vendor becomes insolvent. There's over 100+ pop health companies and big data companies in healthcare today. It is probably pretty safe to say that all but 5 or 6 of those are going to survive. More than likely, most people will be switching vendors. You need to understand how you switch your data, and don't just talk about export, but you need to be able to demonstrate, have demonstrated to you that all data has been actually removed from the cloud environment, and how they're going to actually prove that to you before you ever sign a contract. If you already have a vendor, it should be a discussion you're having with them that if you terminate the contract or something else happens, what are your guarantees that your data is really going to be completely destroyed, and at what level? Typically, you want to use some type of Department of Defense scale in terms of data eradication. Loss of control is a big area of concern. What control do you have? Typically, if you're talking about infrastructure as a service, you have more control than if you're at software as a service. So what is your control? So there's investigative support and incident response. And they're two different things in my eyes. Incident response is the overall response of an incident. So investigative support is you're trying to figure out what happened. Incident response is what you're going to do to deal with it. So let's just take a very easy example. You detect a breach, or somebody else detects a breach, and you're notified, and hopefully that's part of your contract, that you will be notified for any and all breaches that occur, not just those that occur for your organization. Again, loss of control. There's typically language that unless your data is affected or your systems are affected directly, the cloud agency doesn't have to tell you that they've been breached. You get to read about it in the paper if it ever gets to that. You don't want that. You want to be told for any breach that cloud organization comes under. But incident response, let's take the example that you were breached, you figured it out, you know you've been breached, but now you want to do a public relations campaign around it, and you're told that you can't do it because of limitations in marketing rights around your contract. You really need to understand that incident response, when it comes to cloud-based systems, could be a little bit trickier. The big thing to always remember in the cloud that it's you and a bunch of other people that are all very friendly during the sales cycle and usually during the negotiation process. As we all know, once the contract's signed, very few organizations live up to the letter of the law and the spirit of the engagement prior to that signing. So you need to really think about how to protect yourself if something goes wrong, who's in charge. And then there's the weakest link syndrome. In the cloud, again, you're dealing not just with your partners in the cloud, but everybody that they're selling goods and services to. So who in that mix doesn't have the same integrity, passion, and quality levels for security that you do? Because whoever that person is, whoever that organization is, if there's XYZ hospital and you know them and you kind of know that they don't have really the best IT organization and they're not really on top of things, well, that's probably the weakest link. And if they just bought the same services and products that you did and they're hosted on your server or in your environment, they're now your biggest challenge. Because if they do something wrong, it could compromise you. So you need to think about that it's not just you and the people that you contract, but also the people that they contract. It's kind of an interesting viral situation that occurs when you're in the cloud. So let's talk a little bit about control continuum, okay? All this is what are the things that you need to kind of consider at a high level to think about when you're talking about the cloud. So the first one is asset management, change control, the employee background and hiring, the investigative control you'll have, what's the level of patch management, what's the perimeter defense strategy and security strategy that's in place for that cloud provider. And again, if you're dealing with a vendor who's providing you cloud-based services and they're the software vendor, you need to figure all this out for them and for whoever they're relying on for their cloud infrastructure. There are very few, if any, except for some very large organizations like Cerner and Allscripts, who have their own hosted environments. Many of them are contracting with Rackspace or Azure or AWS or some of the others. So you're asking your vendor all of these things as well as their vendors and making sure that they score. At a very high level, the hybrid models have the lowest score. So if 0 is the least secure kind of or control continuum and 10 being the most control, hybrid cloud environment that you get involved in is going to be probably in the area of 1 or 2. Public clouds are probably in the 3 to 4 space. And then privates are going to be up in the 7, maybe 6, 7. You want to be 8+ in order to feel some level of control. Government clouds are in essence private clouds, so I didn't break them out into a separate. This really comes down to what I call MOT, which is management, operation, and technology. So if you start thinking about your continuum of control, you want to really kind of simplify that down to 3 areas that you can look at. We don't have time today to go into every one of these areas, so I'm going to give you a brief kind of high-level thinking on what these areas should contain, what you should be thinking about. So in terms of management, it's really about policy, strategy, governance, and process. And this is as it relates to what you want as well as to how your cloud vendor and cloud hoster are doing things from a management perspective. And then operationally, what's the awareness and training that's going on in this cloud vendor around security, privacy, and risk management? What's their incident management response policy, their configuration management? The reason I bring up configuration management is that usually talks to things like patch management. What information and personal security policies do they have in place? How are they dealing with things? How are they assuring you that your data is really being deleted if you end your account, or if you call and say we need you to delete this? And then technology. What access and audits are going on for their technology? Are you allowed to create your own access and audits? One thing to keep in mind is many of the cloud vendors, as well as the hosting environments or hosting organizations, don't allow you to do penetration testing and assessments, and if they do, they're very restrictive. So you need to really understand how they're doing it. You want to look for key things in that answer. What are they doing around identity and key management? Protection services, not only for you around perimeter defense and intrusion detection and things of that nature, but also at more broadly, physical protection, physical security in terms of your environment. I've seen a lot of systems that are cage-based, which is a challenge. If you want your own physical area, they should be completely blocked off. There should be no cages. There should be solid wall construction, things of that nature. But there's a cost, so you're continually, obviously, trading cost benefits, and you'll ultimately need to decide what makes sense for you or not. So basically, you want to take this list, and it's a much deeper list. If you want the full list, I'll be happy to send it to you via email. But you want to take a list, apply a scoring of what you expect, A, B, C, or a set of points, add up all the points that your vendor gets, and then divide by a factor and see if they get an A, B, C, or F grade from a security perspective for management, operation, and technology of the cloud infrastructure. That's kind of the simplest way to do it. It'll seem more daunting than it really is, but it will help you kind of focus on the key areas that you need to really think about when we talked about concerns and threats earlier on in the presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about the shadow cloud, because the shadow cloud is probably one of the bigger challenges, especially in healthcare. And it obviously affects every industry, but healthcare is such a complicated, large industry with a lot of personalities in it that the shadow cloud is amazingly more prevalent here than I think in most cases. The shadow cloud is simply the cloud that exists within your organization that you either don't know about or you ignore, or you don't think of as the cloud. And hopefully after today, you'll consistently think about this is the cloud and this is how it works. There was a survey done by the Cloud Alliance of several thousand CIOs, and one of the things they found was that 72% of those surveyed, and it's a really strong, large population, and it was an international population, didn't know what existed in the shadow cloud for their organization. They had no idea. They knew it existed, and yet they didn't know really what was in it. And mostly because they don't have the tools, the resources to go out and figure out what's in there. They're also very scared to disrupt the shadow cloud for fear of user backlash. The challenge being, though, that they realized that not doing anything about it would eventually probably bite them. Their biggest concerns were around things like security, obviously, compliance. The big challenge, and this has happened already in healthcare, you can kind of look for these breaches out there, where the user community took data and posted it. They put together a PowerPoint for a research project, they posted it, they did a webinar talking about clinical trial data, research data, and it was using actual patient data. It wasn't de-identified, and suddenly there's a compliance breach, right, a privacy breach. Policy enforcement is another big one in the shadow cloud. Like, how do you really uniformly do policy enforcement? For example, how do you force people to update to the latest version of XYZ software they may be using in the shadow cloud so that security holes are patched? And then there's redundancy and cost, right, which may not be specific to security, But the challenge really is that you may already have contracted services that your organization is providing, which are being duplicated because people are doing that through the shadow cloud. So things to keep in mind. So some things, just to give you a more focused idea of the shadow cloud, the cloud categories, really are file sharing, communication, social media. The list goes on, and you can read it on your own. One of the big ones I see that most people don't think about is things like the websites and social media stuff. That may not, it's not so much the end user using it for their own personal reasons. It's things like corporate communications and the communications or marketing group within a hospital or provider or payer organization using it and not realizing that that's a great attack point. So thinking about these things, they're in the cloud, and you do need to deal with them. The top services, I put some of the top services that we see in the shadow cloud that are affecting your organization. And they're in no specific order. I have seen organizations who have begun to enforce policies where they block these ports and these services. If you haven't done that or haven't considered it, you probably should. I can go on and on as to why it's important, but I also understand the challenge and the user backlash that if you, God forbid, take away some physician's Facebook access. And some of these may be more. There may be real reasons for people using it. They're sad reasons, but they may be using it. There may be physicians or others in your organization who use iCloud for email. That's what they've been using forever to communicate with their office manager. And that's just the way they do it. There's a challenge with this, obviously. There's no easy answer to how do you control or manage the shadow cloud, but you need to be aware that the cloud is there and it's in your organization and probably impacting your security and privacy. You can minimize the footprint. There are certainly things on this list that probably nobody needs to use, but it's part of the world we live in these days. So things to consider: where's your data stored? That was a big piece that we talked about. Is it stored? You really want to know exactly where your data is stored. If for no other reason, if somebody ever tells you, well, we don't reveal that for security services. Reality of life is you're going to need it if you ever want to go after the data from a legal perspective, so you can fill out the data, the court documents. Now, obviously, you can force them to give you the information or name the corporate entity or whatever, but you really want to understand where your data is stored. Another one is understanding what happens when systems are disposed. One of the great benefits of the cloud is economically you can always be on the latest hardware. What happens to the old hardware? Where does it go? Is it sold to a third party? Is that third party selling it to, an overseas entity? How do you know the data has been truly scrubbed? What is the management around that? It's a big, complicated situation, but the last thing you need is some server showing up on the black market that somebody buys and then does some forensics on it and reconstructs your data, and then suddenly you've been breached by your cloud provider not really doing the right thing for you. Who are you sharing with? We talked about the weakest link. So, who are you sharing your data with, and are you comfortable that someone else is sharing services with you? And again, services doesn't just mean your hardware. It could be servicing. They could be sharing your intrusion detection systems. They could be sharing personnel with you. And they could be sharing network segments. So don't just think about this in terms of, oh, well, we have our own box. We're okay. Because more than likely, even if you have a private infrastructure, there is some point in place, unless you've gone all the way to the level of putting dedicated communication lines in place that nobody else can use, and you have your own entire network infrastructure, that you're probably sharing something. And so you need to think about, well, what am I sharing, and who am I sharing it with, and am I confident? What exists in your shadow world? That's a big one we just talked about. Make sure your board and C-suite understand this in the cloud as a whole paradigm and the complexities of it. If for nothing else, to help you justify what you need in order resources, education, and money to adequately support the cloud environment. Make sure your incident response plan is updated and tested to take into account the cloud. One thing we do is if you have an incident response plan, I'm not trying to do a commercial for you, but just give you an example of something to practically think about. And one of the things we'll do is we'll fake an incident give you a scenario. Hey, here's a scenario. You guys respond to it as if it was real, very much like a military kind of simulation. And one of the things we'll throw in there is you need to get to the actual cloud hosting environment and advise them of the fact that you're taking over this response. And we see that that often fails, that you can't do it, or you legally can't do it, or a bunch of other things. So make sure your incident response plan is updated for cloud environments, and then test that plan, come up with crazy scenarios, and see if your plan holds muster. Things that you can do, is it worth the cost is one of the last things to consider, which that's an exercise left to you. Set a cloud security SLA. Very practically understand that you should have a service level agreement that you have with your security vendors, with your cloud vendors. Audit and test your provider. So you're not just auditing the software that you're purchasing, if that's what you're doing. For instance, if you're buying Pop Health or some other type of software from a vendor, you also want to test their provider. So make sure you're testing the entire chain. We often, when doing assessment tests, we'll find that, hey, the software is pretty robust, except for the API level. But let's say we get past that and you have pretty strong software, we'll often find that the DNS servers being used by the vendor, because it's being managed by a third party, are vulnerable. Or the administration consoles are based on PHP or Perl or Python, and they're vulnerable. So, the software, you may come back and find out, hey, that's all good, but you may find that the cloud infrastructure isn't as good as it could be. And you start realizing that, oh, this stuff's all connected, and suddenly somebody, does an attack pivot on us and then goes from there. Find the shadow links. You can go out and do discoveries, do surveys of your users, find out what services they're using, and figure out, if there's a way to corral that or contain it. And there's some practical strategies you can. It's a lot cheaper for you to provide what I would call social computing stations that are dedicated for people doing things like checking their email, their Facebook, their LinkedIn, whatever they want, and keep that separate than your operating or clinical and business environments. So that's an option that you could do. And it's actually, if you do it right, actually is a very cool thing to do, because you can put them in break areas, lunchrooms, and it becomes more of a cafe experience than a, kind of draconian, you can't do this. So I'd be happy to share thoughts with that for people that are thinking of, okay, how do we get the shadow world under control? There's some other things you can do there as well. Rate your provider using that MOP scoring. Create your own ideas around it, but come up with a score with them, see how it translates to an A, B, C, or F grade. I don't put D in there because I don't think you really want a D provider providing your client your cloud solution. C would even be a little bit kind of why you're doing business with them. Focus on your supply chain within the cloud environment, meaning, who is it that you're dealing with besides just the vendor that's offering you the solution? And are they a weak link? We already talked about, sorry about the repeat, the SLA. And then take a holistic view of your cloud environment, the shadow cloud versus, whatever cloud services you're contracting for, and understand how they come together. One of the big things, the BYOD, I had this on a previous slide, I didn't, BYOD didn't talk about it. The bring your own device is probably one of the largest challenges to you managing the cloud environment and securing that shadow cloud. So think about your BYOD policies and what's there, and how you're going to deal with that. It's a very tricky, thorny issue for healthcare, but it's there. Real quick commercial, I'll take 2 seconds. We are sponsoring a conference called Hacking Healthcare. If you use HIS Talk as a promo code, we're going to be talking about this and a lot of other things, Stuxnet, and a variety of other things related specifically to healthcare. So just heads up on that. I want to thank you for being a part of this. Love to hear feedback. If you have questions, I'll do my best to give you, as credible an answer as possible. If I can't, I'll be honest with you and tell you that's not something I know about. So if there are any questions at this time, Lori, let's have them.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Now we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions, as John just said. And as a reminder, please use the questions section on the GoToWebinar panel to submit your questions. Okay, the first question, do you think vendors are doing all that they can? And obviously you probably don't. What would the first steps be for a vendor to start getting on the right track?
I'm assuming you mean a software vendor.
Yeah.
So the first thing would be just, a broad scope review of their API and their security. And it's not a negative, and it's not a slight at the vendors. I mean, I can tell you from my days at Allscripts and Eclipsys, and software is complicated. It's hard to write, and it's hard to deal with and balance security versus user features and usability. But that would be the first step. The second step would be, if I'm a vendor, if I was running, a company that was offering cloud services and relying on third parties for the cloud, it would be to really analyze my cloud contract with my cloud hoster and make sure that we're partnered and we're able to go to market with an offering to our clients around, how we're going to support them if there is a breach, how we're going to support them if, they need to do incident response or investigation. How do we support them on an ongoing basis with assessments and vulnerability? Because I think a lot of vendors can turn it around and make it security a differentiator. Because I would be hard-pressed to believe that if you have the features and the functionality and you're able to layer on top of that a very robust security story for a CIO, CMIO, CMO, CFO, depending who the audience is, that it wouldn't really set you apart. I didn't mention it in this presentation, but one of the top concerns everybody has about going to the cloud and population health is security. It's almost like all the vendors kind of do the same things at varying degrees, but their security strategy, nobody's differentiated themselves there. So those would be my key feedback pieces to them.
All right. Alfred would like to know if Anthem had a weak cloud service.
I don't think so. Not that we know of. Anthem, we haven't found anything that really points to their organization in and of itself being weak or not managing their environment or infrastructure, not in accordance with what I would call, best practices. So, that breach was just, part of an ongoing attack that they fell victim to. It doesn't mean they couldn't have done things to prevent it or done things better or not, but I don't think if there's a smoking gun that says, wow, you really should have had passwords on those accounts or something, like that.
Do you think we'll see another Anthem or something as big or larger than that breach?
Personally, I do, just simply because I think, within the world we live in, healthcare, it's really complicated. I have a lot of respect for CIOs and CISOs just because of the complexity. On the average, most hospitals have 300 to 400 systems. A lot of people think about the EMR and this. They forget a hospital has everything that a finance industry business would have, or a retailer, right? We have HR systems, we've got time scheduling, we've got all the financial systems, accounting, AP, general ledger, all of those things. And on top of that, we've got all the clinical systems and all the departmental systems and all the biomedical devices, all of which, are computing devices, and then the mobility stuff, and then now we've got HIEs and, what we're doing to exchange data if, the HIEs aren't the route you're taking. That's a really complicated world. So will we see something else? Yeah, I suspect we will. Luckily, major breaches have been focused on things like the insurers, payers, and others. My hope is, honestly, I would hope we don't, but it's a really hard thing in a secure environment. And I'm sure the CIOs, day by day or minute by minute, are wondering, am I next, or have I already been breached and I just don't know it.
All right, thanks. That was our last question. For those of you attending, if you have a question you think of you'd like to ask John later, you can send it to me and I'll forward it along to him. But with that, we'll conclude our webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you, John, for another great informative presentation. Attendees, keep an eye on your emails because you'll be getting a follow-up that has a link to the recording of the webinar as well as a PDF version of the PowerPoint presentation. We look forward to seeing you at our next HIS Talk webinar. Have a great day.